Today on In Good Faith, I'm very pleased to bring you one of my hoped-for guests for many years, and I'm so pleased, Krista Tippett, that you are here in our fair city and at BYU.
Me too.
Just as a quick intro, and a lot of this will be familiar to public radio listeners, Krista is a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster, National Humanities Medalist, and also a New York Times best-selling author. She created and hosts On Being, which is one of the highest honors in broadcast, internet, and podcasting. And she leads the On Being project, producing a second successful podcast, Poetry Unbound. I will ask about poetry. I'm excited about that. And evolving to meet the callings of the post-2020 world. Emergent in 2024 is the Lab for the Art of Living, alongside gatherings and quiet conversations to accompany the generative people and possibilities within this tender, tumultuous time to be alive. Krista grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, attended Brown University, and worked as a young journalist and a diplomat in Cold War Berlin, and later received a Master of Divinity from Yale. Her books are Speaking of Faith, Einstein's God, and most recently Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. Krista, I love the whole small town thing for the reason that you could have a small view. You do not have a small view. In fact, one of your interviews, you talked about the immensity of our life experience. Would young you be surprised at what you've done, where you've gone, and who you've spoken to in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, well, I think about this a lot these days because I don't know, now because the world kind of comes to everyone wherever they are through the internet. I think it's hard to imagine back what it was to live in a small town 60 years ago. Because the world out there to me was just this black, this big mystery. And I wouldn't even say that I was that curious about it until I got a bit older. So I think it was possible to be isolated in a way that it's hard to be isolated now, probably for better and for worse, that there's an upside to that. So I think, yes, that I had leapt into that void and made a world out there would have been really shocking, but I hope intriguing to my younger self. I think, though, I think I've had so many wonderful opportunities, partly a lot, but, good fortune. And then also, I'm trying to get better at giving my younger self credit, having some chutzpah. But I think coming from that small place and that place that was far away from the world and isolated in that way made me so appreciative. And I mean, to this day, I never take it for granted that I get to move around in such a wide world.
And you did take a leap when you said, I'm going to Europe for education and then continue to work there. When did you get that idea of, I've got to explore a little bit bigger?
So, I went to, in high school, I think what opened my mind more than the schooling was the kind of drama and debate that I did. I think that's what kind of opened my creative, curious side. And I went to summer debate camp in Chicago the summer before my senior year in high school. And I met all these kids who had such a different upbringing from me. And they were all going away to college, which really had not been a concept. And so, that was the beginning because I had this best friend in Chicago that summer who wanted to go to Brown, and I had never heard of Brown. And in the end, there were 50 kids in her school applying, and I was the only person for miles around applying from where I was from. And so that was kind of the first leap. And then I really felt like, then going to Germany, I just got interested in that whole Cold War division of the world, which I think also, because I'd grown up, in a very immersively religious world as well, with this sense of, and my grandfather was a real hellfire and brimstone Southern Baptist preacher. So I kind of had this, I thought I had left this behind, but to some extent, this idea of, the battle between good and evil. But I think that the Cold War actually was just a great representation of that.
Yeah, and you were right there on the
and
front
I
line.
ended up kind of putting myself there. But I think in my religious imagination really was that it was a great canvas for that, for me to continue that in a way.
I wonder if I could explore just a little bit what you so often ask about spiritual beginnings, because they do plant some seeds, some that turn out to be weeds and some that turn out to be something really beautiful. Do you feel like you accepted what you were taught? What was your concept of God or spirituality, in those younger years?
I just say it was immersive, and it was mostly wonderful, right? I mean, it absolutely was. The other thing is, church was not just church. It was the center of social life. It was where friendships were based.
Yeah.
It was really the world. It was the context of life, not just religion. My grandfather, had a second grade education and was just this wonderful, actually very intelligent. I knew that he had a beautiful mind, and he loved his Bible. But he'd never been, I even think I intuited this at the time, although I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate it. I felt like he was frightened to apply his mind to his Bible, right? Like to ask questions.
Like what might happen if something cracked?
Yes. Like he hadn't been invited to know that he could also, so when I finally went to seminary, which was a surprising thing to that me who went to Brown, that I would end up going to seminary 10 years later, and just loving theology and, understanding, sort of digging your mind into sacred text, was just a way to go deeper, right? And it could withstand critical questions, right? Like it was there for that. And he didn't know that. But I did, I feel like it was, for the most part, very fulfilling. And I did actually kind of ask my questions and find that the text and the community could hold those.
Yeah.
I think, there's a lot about my life and my spiritual life and my religious sensibility that is very different from my grandfather. But the thing that I'm aware of now at this point in my life that I'm so grateful for is I feel like he imparted me with this sense that has never left me, that, of course the world is a puzzling place, a mysterious place, but that somehow there is a love behind this. There is a love that holds this. And as I grow older, I realize what a gift it is to have that kind of grounding.
You find you can lean into that a little, or
I
rest
can.
into
and
that?
I'm also, it's more mysterious than it's ever been before, right? But I can somehow hold it. It's true. And how to make sense of it, it's different on any given day.
In your book, Einstein's God, you have a conversation, and Francis Bacon comes up talking about the Word of God.
Yes.
Actually, you're
Yes.
asking about this to the guest, but
Right.
also the Word that is the work of God, and seeing the natural world as also kind of a scripture or a
Yes.
guide. It
Yes.
seems like you've married those very naturally, the
Yeah.
concept of exploration.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I have. I mean, it was a process, right? It unfolded.
At one point, you thought, I'm going to make a show.
Yeah.
And so, post 9/11, and speaking of faith, what did you think that an audience needed? What did the show need to be as you were putting that together?
Yeah, such a great question for me to reflect back on. Well, so I had, just walked into this world of high geopolitics, right, in my 20s, and had some incredible experiences, and kind of been a journalist and come in through this side door of diplomacy. And I'm so grateful for all of that. I mean, it's just an incredible experience, incredible skill sets. But I also came out of those years pretty confused because it wasn't me. And what I had started getting, what I started to understand, that where I wanted to go deeper was not that high level of the people moving the missiles around, which was important, but I was really, asking this question of, what is important? What is life with a capital L? Right? What is important with a capital I? And what I was fascinated by in that Berlin, that divided Berlin, which was really like taking this one people, one language, one history, one city, splitting it in half, where people on both sides of the wall are really handed completely different realities.
Yes.
I mean, even
Yes.
realities that have missiles pointed at each other, but totally different value sets, political systems, economic systems. And what I observed, because I came to know and love people on both sides of the wall, was really this elemental human drama of people either make lives of meaning or they don't. And I saw people on the Eastern side who did not have the freedom or the agency, or just the space, but who created these lives of dignity and intimacy and beauty and value. And then people on the Western side who had everything, right? Freedom and all the materials and, all the room to move in and didn't. And what I think fascinated me was that human condition aspect of the Cold War. What happens to a human being in these different circumstances, and how what it still comes down to is whether we make lives of meaning that are worthwhile. And so as I started to, it's what I eventually realized with that is that I wanted to study theology, because this is the part of the human enterprise where that is interrogated.
Yeah.
And I was also recovering my spiritual life and, starting to read again. And initially I was kind of reading mystical texts and, but just realizing that I wanted to take religion seriously for myself and also in the world as a force and as a place where this kind of inquiry and this kind of engagement happens. So when I came out of that, I had no idea that I could do anything with this theology degree. But to your question, what I carried into eventually this idea for a radio show was that I had kind of, gone deep in what is this part of us and the human enterprise. Yeah. And realizing that it is so critical and is offering questions and resources and wisdom. And then in contrast, especially kind of starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, the religion was just presented in mostly violent or exclusionary or inflammatory sound bites.
Yeah.
And so the disconnect for me was, we need this, right? And this is important in human life. And it runs through how everyone, how people are present in all of these other activities. So I just wanted to have a place where there could be naming and conversation and exploration of, this religious, spiritual aspect of us. And then as it runs through all the other disciplines. And then in the early 2000s, with, having an evangelical president in the White House and then 9/11, suddenly religion is everywhere in the headlines again, often in a very simplified and destructive way.
Kind of totally black and white.
Terrible. And so I really just wanted to get at the complexity of how this is lived and all the nuance in real life. And with particularity, not as, the depths and particularity of the different traditions and what they actually offer up to the whole.
And just looking at little snapshots from over your career, whether it was speaking of faith, on being, or with poetry that you're featuring a podcast right now, I've been intrigued in speaking of faith. You do mention how stories are important, and they're important in journalism, but they're often only used in a one-dimensional way.
Yeah.
So to me, I think I would say there's an art to what you do, because you do want to tell stories, but you're finding a way to not just report facts, but to explore the meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is that what's connected? Can you say what has connected with
poetry
with listeners, with poetry?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've kind of made an idol of storytelling, like if it's a story, if there's a story. But I'm like, and yeah, we stories are these precious ways we have to convey truth. But I'm also interested in okay, so what, right? So
Yeah.
that's the story. So what? What does it mean? What do we do with that? Why does it matter? Why I've connected with listeners. I mean, I just think there's much, one of the things people said to me in public radio at the beginning for years was, well, first of all, they said things like, I would show them statistics like 90% of, like 98% of Americans say they pray, whether they're religious or not. Or, I would just say, look, this is a huge part of life. And they'd say, well, maybe that's true, but I don't think public radio listeners, I don't think public radio listeners are religious, which is absurd. Or if they are, they want to keep it private. Well, that wasn't true. And, another thing that was interesting from the beginning of the show is we always had a lot of listeners who were atheist or agnostic or somehow alienated from their traditions or, in a place of confusion. But I think what it did for people like that is allow them into the the moral deliberations that are so alive in our time. And they had felt kind of separated and cut off from that. But I think what I always have tried to do is not just interview people about what they know and what they do, like what they know and what they do maybe is important, but also how that connects to who they are and how they live. And also not just be focused on the answers people have, which, we're just so focused on answers and opinions and, that's generally what people get drawn out about in media. But what are the questions they live? And what are the questions that have arisen through what they've learned?
It almost seems like by doing that, you are presenting listeners with possibilities. Like, here are how some other people are experiencing this spiritual portion of their life.
Yeah. And also I think maybe taking people off, yes, we can be talking to somebody who's very wise and possibly very accomplished, but also just meeting them in the fullness of their humanity, which is never looks heroic. It's not. And I actually,
we all have to brush our teeth.
That's right. And we all have had a lot of things go wrong. So one of the things that troubled me in journalism, that was another kind of flowing into this, was how, journalism is so sophisticated at analyzing and articulating, the worst case exemplar of humanity, or the catastrophic event, or the person who really does something evil, right? They're so good at giving thousands of words to that, investigating. But when you would have a piece about a person who is good, right, or had done something beautiful, it would be this hero piece, and I actually really don't like that language of hero. And, one of the things that I learned to love about the Hebrew Bible when I went to divinity school, which I don't think I got when I was growing up, was there are no heroes in the Hebrew Bible, right? Everybody is flawed and three-dimensional, technicolor, dramatic. And so those hero stories actually don't do justice. So one of my operating questions for this show is how to make goodness as riveting as evil. Because evil is inherently riveting just in our bodies.
Yeah.
Because our bodies, which, we're learning more and more about this, our bodies are really always trying to keep us safe, and they are always looking for danger. And then when we get served up a story about danger, we just go there. And so I think one of my great aspirations was yes, interview people who are good and wise, which never means perfect, and really get into the complexity of that and what that means to live that and the drama of that, so that too can be riveting. And I think, yes, encouraging and inspiring, but in a way that feels oh yeah, there are ways that person has lived that I can live that way too.
Are there guests you might have had who might have fit into that category, but maybe they weren't willing to be as forthcoming about some of the dents and dings. How do you narrow in on this will be a good person for what we want to?
That we have a real process of vetting for. And, it's become second nature at this point. But in the beginning, I had to figure this out. And so, for example, I haven't interviewed many politicians. And also I'm pretty light on religious leaders or just people, because they are often they are often in a position of representing a group.
Right.
And therefore can't just speak in a just searching way, for themselves. And academics often. I used to be more aware of this. I'm not so aware of this now. But what I'm looking for is somebody who can speak out of the depth of their knowledge but also can go into places that might be revealing and searching.
Yeah.
And so people who can be really comfortable speaking at that intersection, again, of like what they know and who they are. And like, yes, what they've learned, what they know, and the questions they still are working with.
I mean, there's people you have spoken with who we would know their names, Thich Nhat Hanh and others that we'd gravitate to because we know something about. But it's so intriguing to me that when you get this hugely meaningful interview from someone that you have to sort of introduce to us.
Yeah.
There was a Persian poet, in fact, this may have been the episode about Rumi that you, I think, won the Peabody Award for.
Yeah, Fateme Kashavars.
And as I was listening, I was thinking, there is so much background that has been winnowed through to get to this clarity that you were sharing with us. But also your guest, a poet herself. I just thought, how did these two connect? I mean, you did the work to do that, and it really created something connecting for me to both Rumi from, the 1300s to her sitting there right there arguing with her family about Persian poetry.
I have always, I most love, sometimes people have asked me across the years, like, what's your list of people you most want to interview? And I did have that list. Like Desmond Tutu was at the top of that list for a long time. And I finally got him. But at some point that list fell away because I am always looking for the people who are just below the radar, but who are just so formative and meaningful for people in their world or in their discipline. And that's another way. I'm not looking for the heroes who like make the news, but the people who are just imprinting lives around them and teaching and being role models in ways that, most of us will never see. Because these are the people who are making the world go around,
Yeah, but don't people tell you sometimes, thank you for modeling how to have a discussion on touchy subjects?
Don't people say that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a service you're providing to show people you can talk about these topics without and create light instead of heat, or at least a little more of one than the other.
But I don't think it's as hard as people imagine it to be. I really think it's about the creation of an ethos. It's about I feel like one of the most important things to me is creating an atmosphere of hospitality in my interviews and intellectual hospitality, but even just, I mean, I would say you've done this here too, right? Like, just the thing is, we are animal, we live in bodies, right? So a conversation between two people starts before the words are spoken, in terms of how you start. You get relaxed or not, right? You feel safe, or you feel like, okay, I need to be on guard. And so even things like that, creating an ethos of, you're here because I respect you, and we may get into complicated, important things, but in a spirit of wanting to understand.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you something I've never asked anyone, because sometimes people will ask me, how do you know what to ask people? And I say, well, you prepare, and sometimes something just comes to you. But if I had to actually really sort of, without covering anything up, say, what is the most helpful to me, it is, I often feel that I love the people that I'm talking with, which sounds a little weird, like not like a fan, or could we go have dinner, but the people who are willing to be open, I just feel like I love them. And you talk about love as well as this undergirding thing that holds us up. And that's something I feel in your conversations.
I definitely feel that. I mean, you and I are also fortunate because we get to choose who we interview.
Oh, that's
we're looking, and we look for people who we might just, feel gravitate towards. Because sometimes people have said to me, will say, there's this assumption. Well, so people who are in news journalism or news interviewing, you are given who you interview because of what happened today or yesterday. Yeah. And we get to kind of hold the space for those people who we want to know more about what they have to say. We respect and admire, intrigued by, and we feel like, right? I think I choose people who I think other people would like to know they exist and, and understand the way they are in the world.
What do you know now, spiritually, that if you can put your finger on something as ephemeral as that, that you didn't know 30 years ago about God or the divine or...
Yeah.
It seems like you would have had, besides divinity school, a real practical education and learning opportunities from all the varied guests.
Yeah. Yeah. What do I know about God? I mean, I know that word is very small for what we're pointing at. And so, I would just say, I think I've known that for a long time, but I think that the fullness of, I think, when I think back to my grandfather, part of his fear of engaging his mind or of asking questions also was a fear of mystery. Like he really needed, he felt like it was supposed to be about answers and rules.
Certainty.
Certainty. And something that really intrigues me at the orthodox core of our traditions is this reverence for mystery. Right? Like on the one hand, we are called to be discerning truth and living by truth and, and believing and living according to that. And then we're also in the depths, given to know that there are things we won't fully understand in this lifetime. And I think that sense of mystery as something to revere has just become more big and beautiful for me, and it doesn't contradict, right, the places of certainty that I have. So I think that's a big one for me. And then it's been interesting because I didn't know when I started out that poets would be so interesting to me, right. And I also didn't know that I would interview so many scientists. And one of the things I love about interviewing scientists, and again, I'm choosing my scientists, right? Like I'm choosing the scientists who will open themselves to this kind of conversation. But they're often not religious, but they have such a robust vocabulary of mystery, and they welcome it. They welcome the fact that once you've made a big discovery, the very next thing that is upon you are the new questions you have to ask.
Endlessly multiplying.
And there's something really exciting about that.
So have you had moments where you suddenly felt that something bigger, that it's hard for us to explain, but we sense this presence, or there was something bigger moving or going on? I mean, it sounds a little small to ask. As you look back, do you see that you were led or prepared or have a sense of mission?
Yeah. But I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question quite so directly. I do. And I don't. Yeah. Well, I'm talking a lot these days about the language of calling and vocation. I really think that is, I just think to be alive now in this century, there are just these civilizational callings, right? In terms of our relationship to the natural world. Our relation, the racial kind of reckoning. I mean, I feel like we have all these things that are reckonings, like race and ecology, and really, I feel like we have to reinvent politics and economics, right? Like we really have to reinvent everything. And they are reckonings, and they're crises, and they're challenges, and they're callings. Like how do each of us, and none of us can solve any of them, much less take them all together. But I think this work of, getting into discernment about what is mine to touch, like what is the world I can see and touch, and where I can be present, because all these civilizational callings, interestingly, also have a really intimate component. They all affect us in very direct ways in our lives. So I'm just saying that because I think about that a lot these days, and I think that I definitely think I got that kind of vocabulary and sensibility growing up. And as much as I might have thought I had left it behind, I think it was embedded in me, right? And I feel so blessed, really, like, with, and I know, I think vocation is also this interesting interplay between, with effort. It's not just that these things land with you and you step into them, right? That there's
you might be called to pursue them. Maybe.
Yeah, there's always there's what's given to you, there's what's shown to you, there's the things you step into, and then there's what you do with that, right? And so it's always this back and forth. And maybe, my upbringing, my Southern Baptist upbringing also, gave me this, this sense of being of service, right? And I think that's really valuable. And that's another piece of language and sensibility that I feel like our religious traditions carry forward in our life together, that our whole life together needs, whether people are religious or not, right? This is such a contribution and a gift. But yeah, I remember early on, I think I was with some Christian group, and somebody asked me if I considered this work to be calling or vocation, and I said yes, but I think I said if it's not a calling to preach but to listen. They were kind of a preachy group.
What a great line.
Yeah, and that's where a question can be such a gift, because I really just kind of walked forward with that. I think that's my calling, my sacred calling, right, is listening. And then there is what do you do with that? Yeah.
Well, you found a way to share the fruits of that.
Yeah. One thing I'll say about that too is I was always very impatient when I was young, and at this remove, right, of over 20 years, and it's like I have a lot of conversations with younger people, and it's hard to have everything feels so immediate and existential, right, for the first half of life. And then you live a while and you realize actually life is long and complex, and often the things that you think you want they're going to teach you by not being what you wanted after all, right? It's so much more complicated than you think it is. And so I would say a real gift to me, because I had to fight so hard to get my show on public radio, and then really to get it taken seriously, even for 10 years. But there's such value in doing something over a long stretch of time. And, in terms of this seeing of the calling and what it meant and why it matters, that's not something that reveals itself immediately. That's something I'm taking in now at 20 years.
So there's a time you may have thought, am I just knocking on the wrong door?
Yeah, you don't know. And I think at some point, this is true of calling too, you have to believe, you have to know what you know, and you have to walk forward, and there will be obstacles, and there will be people who don't get it, probably more of them than the ones who get it. But there's really a reward, right? The reward is in the sticking with it and in the growing with it.
You've had a transition from speaking of faith to on being, and now what's the name of the poetry podcast?
Well, the poetry podcast is Poetry Unbound, and that's that's my colleague Padre Gotuma who does that. Although I have also interviewed poetry is a really important part of on being.
And if I could talk about Mary Oliver, because just that interview, I've listened to at least 3 times, and first of all, I just thought, wow, we get to hear her voice, and then when she said, well, I wrote that poem as one of her best-known poems. Well, I was showing a friend how you do this particular technique.
I know, wild geese, I know.
Yeah, but she had something.
What a revelation.
She had something, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, already inside her that was able to pour into that.
Yeah.
So my sense with you is that it's the spiritual aspect of poetry that is why you love the poetry so much. What is it about?
Yeah. Well, so I've had to think about this and wrestle with it too, because I don't interview poets about poetry for the most part. It's about where poetry comes from in us and what it is distinctively giving voice to that we don't give voice to with our other kinds of words, and what it works in us when we hear it or write it. And, and I've collected some, and, Mary Oliver was just such a, that was just this gift in her, right? She was really just like walking through the world as a receptacle, right? With her notebook in front of her.
And she said she spent so long writing really bad poetry, but kept at it. Speaking of pursuing the calling.
Yeah. And she was constantly feeling, had this sense of gift and of things that just, were given. And, how she would say also, like, you have to have your notebook with you at all times because you may get this poem right now. It won't be there half an hour from now when you get home. I have some favorite definitions that have helped me think about this too. So David Whyte, the poet, says, poetry is language against which we have no defense. If you think about that, in this world we inhabit now, where in social media, in these most highly public spaces where we are exchanging words with each other, and how it's all offense and defense, right? It's right, and to think about poetry, words that
does poetry require slowing down?
Yeah, and it's something about the form of a poem. You just can't argue with it. It may make you uncomfortable. Like you may not know what to do with it, but it does not invite a fight. And I think poetry also has a way of raising questions in a way that reminds us that questions sometimes are there to dwell with. Like, I think we think questions need answers right away.
Yeah.
But, my best example of that is the poem that, just to come back to something you said a minute ago, the poem that Elizabeth Alexander read at the first Obama inauguration. And she had this word, this sentence, this question, what if the mightiest word is love? And I just think that is a question that I think it's a question we're called to live. And boy, is it far from, like, I just mean, the great collective we, like the American we, the global we are so far from that. But I don't think there's any question that love is the mightiest word and the hardest thing and the most worth it. The hardest skill. The 20th century had this idea that the hard skills are, computing and rationality and facts and numbers. And they're nothing against like the ability to love or not to love.
Well, I love that poetry is that thing against which we have no defense.
Against which we have no defense. Yeah.
So if I can quote a line of poetry in a final question to you, again from Mary Oliver, because you got her to be so forthcoming with the wild geese. When she talks about this one wild and precious life and what you will do with it. So you have productive decades ahead of you, unless you decide to go work on your tan on a beach somewhere.
No, I don't think the Southern Baptist in me will let me do that.
But you also have enough time and experience to have perspective on your own wild and precious life.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking you must be really happy about some of those struggles that you stuck with and choices, or any commentary about that.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to turn 64 next month. And I actually love aging. I think it's just like the best kept secret that it's such a relief to grow older. I am
64 and I'm telling you, it's just fine.
I know. It's so great to relax and not need to prove yourself in the way that you do when you're younger, and you just know some things, and you just know that it's messy and it's okay and it's just a given. Yeah, where I am now is, asking how I best spend my energy in my life force. And my energy is different than it used to be. And I wouldn't say it's less, but it's different. And I think, it's interesting to me because right now, one of the things that gives me the most joy is, and I wouldn't have expected this, right? That across these 20 years, because I was looking for those people, below the radar, like all over in all kinds of different fields, who are imprinting lives and like really being healing and creative forces in ways that still have to bubble up in culture, but are, we just live in this time where so much that we got handed from the 20th century just it doesn't work, doesn't make sense anymore. But we're like this in-between generation who have to make up the new forms. And I see that happening everywhere, but it's going to take time for all of that to become, the reality that we can all see. And so the thing that's giving me such joy now is like having this view of who's out there and people who are not necessarily visible on the larger canvas, and connecting dots, like connecting people who should know each other and projects that should know each other. That is such a gift. And just every time I get to make those connections, create that connective tissue, that human connective tissue, that feels like maybe that's what all this was about, is giving me this view and this capacity to do that. Now, I don't think that's the only thing, but that's where I am right now, is asking, and I'm also really interested now in what I'm calling quiet conversations. So conversations, because our culture, for so many reasons that I have a lot of compassion for, is just so hyper reactive. We're just all in, I think that, but there's so many things we need to talk about quietly and with tenderness, and it just can't happen in public. So I'm doing more that's like behind closed doors that, will not be broadcast. And that also feels like an important calling right now for me. So that's kind of where I am, is discerning the next step.
Krista Tippett, a lifetime of asking questions. I don't know if that, as a young person, would have sounded satisfying to you or not. You may have said, well, do I get any answers? But whether it was faith or on being, how to be, or looking at how poetry speaks to us, calls to us. Thanks for your lifetime of questions and the answers they've given, and the ones they've just left hanging for us to think about.
Yeah, thank you for this beautiful interview. Thank you.